Hi, everybody. So in this video, I'm going to be looking at Jesus's closing teaching to his famous Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 7. It's one we're all very familiar with. So as I read here, I want you to be turning on your What's Weird radar, as we have been doing all semester, and see if anything just feels off to you. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. At first, this might all seem somewhat normal. Maybe we're like, well, why is a dude building his house on sand? That might seem strange. However, in cultures like these, where you have quite a bit of sand lying around, it is not uncommon to use sand in general is often mixed into concrete, but you have especially kind of sand-heavy concrete in countries like these. I believe it's called a sandcrete block. That's maybe not that strange. The thing that strikes me as a weird detail is what happens when the storms come. The rain came down. That makes sense to me. The winds blew and beat against that house. That makes sense to me. I've experienced both of those things. The streams rose is what really kind of throws me, especially because we're in the Middle East, right? Like, how many, massive floods that could sweep your house away are happening in Palestine, right? We'll kind of pin that for a second. Let's talk a little bit about what we think this means. I think for us, when we read this story, the focus tends to be on what is the building material of your house, right? What are you building your foundation out of? Is it rock or is it sand? And we can tie that to all kinds of things. I think I've typically tied it to something like, what are you putting your hope in? Are you putting your hope in Jesus, or are you putting your hope in, money or approval or whatever else? Perfectly good thing to meditate on. A very Western reading, given that that's kind of intellectual and very private. And I do think it's crucial that we remember this is the end of a whole sermon. And the thing that distinguishes these two men, according to this analogy, is what they do. Both of them hear Jesus' words, but one puts them into practice and one does not. We're gonna push a little bit against our Protestant kind of faith alone thing here. We're not talking about salvation, obviously, but Jesus is putting a very heavy emphasis on if you listen to this sermon and you get it, you're gonna put it into practice. And if not, here's what that looks like. So let's build out this image a little bit, because I don't think the focus is actually on what your house is built out of. Rather, I think Jesus is pointing to a geographical feature of where he lives. And he's pointing not to what your house is built out of, but where are you building your house? So in the area where Jesus is teaching, there's not a lot of rainfall. There's like 2 months of rainy season. And most of that rain is happening up in the Judean hills, kind of east of the Mediterranean Sea. So most of the year, the ground is just bone dry, right? So when the rain falls down then, it doesn't really sink into the ground. It just starts rushing down these hills into this dry land. So that happens over thousands of years. What happens is the rain starts to cut these canyons into the desert. And these canyons are called wadis, W-A-D-I. And they're a very common feature if you're out in the wilderness. Jesus probably spent some time in wadis during his time, out in the desert. And the thing that's interesting about wadis is what happens when the rainy season happens. Because again, if you imagine you've got all this rain coming down, and it's just going to funnel straight into these canyons, right? So what does that look like? I'm actually going to show you a video of what this looks like. Just as a preface, nobody is killed in this video, I promise. But this is a good illustration of kind of what happens when we have a big storm in a wadi.
يلا يا شباب يلا يلا خطير ترى خطير يا شباب خطير يا خطير يلا يا شباب
So that's pretty nuts, right? Like you have this sudden massive flash flood that just overtakes everything. People who commonly like lead tours and things in the Middle East often talk about if you're in a wadi and you hear the sound of like a train coming, you've got about 30 to 40 seconds to get out before you get swept away. And this image of a wadi, which by the way, I'm pulling quite a bit of this from Marty Solomon's excellent Images of the Desert series in his Bema Discipleship podcast. I'll put a link to that in the email if you'd like to check that out. He's led tours and things like this in the Middle East, so he's much more familiar with this stuff than I am. You can see David in the Psalms talk about this. So for instance, in Psalm 69, "Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in the miry depths where there is no foothold," right? Now, all this dry land is suddenly inundated with water. Now I'm sinking down into the mud. I can't even, scramble out. I have come into deep waters. The floods engulf me. How do you get in water up to your neck unless it happens very quickly, right? So David's in a wadi, flash flood, and this is all a metaphor, right? But a flash flood comes and he's engulfed. This idea of sudden calamity, sudden crisis. Psalm 40 gives us another image of this. "I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. And what did he do? He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand." So if there's a flood happening in a wadi, where do you want to be? You want to be on top of it. You want to be up on the sides, right? Looking down into the canyon. That is the safe place to be because you are above the flood. You're not going to be swept away. So now I just want to think about if we're using this image now, where the streams rise and the house, is being beaten down. Think of the kind of person who builds a house in a wadi, right? That's insane behavior. Like, you're really not from around here. You really don't get how things work. And it kind of makes sense because most of the year it's dry. It looks like a perfectly fine place to put a house. You're protected from the wind, all that stuff. But then all of a sudden, everything gets swept away, right? Because you are in the wadi. So what do we take from this? I've been thinking about this passage for a while now as it relates to the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount is basically laying a map. He's rewriting our kind of trajectory of what we think the good life is. The good life is not the American dream of like up and to the right and acquire a bunch of stuff. A lot of the time in the Sermon on the Mount, by the way, Jesus doesn't say you should do this and you shouldn't do that, right? He doesn't say you shouldn't get angry with your brother. He just says when you are angry with your brother in your heart, it's like murdering them. He's just stating facts about reality. Right? He's reorienting us to what reality is actually like. He's kind of showing us this is the way things look around here. Nursing anger in your heart or looking at someone lustfully without physically acting on it or hating your enemy or being anxious about tomorrow, all of these things. You might think that these are normal, that these keep you safe, that they do all these things. But I'm telling you, that is in the wadi. That is down at the bottom. And when the flood comes, there's going to be a great crash. The way that the world has taught you to operate based off of me first, vengeance is mine, and accumulate as much as you can, all this stuff, it's going to work about 80% of the time, and then the flood's going to come and it's going to crash everything down. But if you hear my words, if you hear what I'm saying, if you believe what I'm saying in this sermon, and you do what I'm saying, if you reorient your life around the reality that I am showing you, then when the storm comes, because the storm's going to come, it's the exact same storm in both scenarios, you are above it. It's that you're still going to get hit with rain, you're still going to have wind blowing, but you are not down in the thick of it being overwhelmed. You are in a sturdy place looking down on it. I think then this teaching should prompt all of us to go back through this sermon, ask ourselves, what is the world? What is the reality that Jesus is painting? And how does my life square? Do I live my life as if what Jesus is saying is true? Or am I down in the wadi? So just some thoughts on that. I'll have another one of these out next week. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you have a lovely Christmas time. Bye.